Hey guys, this is Austin, and today I'm here with a gaming PC build for $1,500. Now this is a high-end PC that's really aimed at getting you maximum performance out of your games, as well as of course pretty much anything else you throw at it, thanks to the brand new Intel Haswell CPU, as well as the GTX 700 series graphics card. To give you an idea of the performance, here's a demo of the PC running Battlefield 3. Now here all the settings are turned up to Ultra, and the resolution is set to 1080p, and as you can see here it pretty much stays above 60 frames per second at all times. Moving on, we have Far Cry 3, another game that looks fantastic, especially as you're able to turn the settings up. Here we have no problem there being able to turn everything up to Ultra, as well as running 8 times anti-aliasing, and still the PC handles it no problem. Next up we have Crysis 3, which is by far one of the best looking PC games ever. So here we're able to run on very high settings, so pretty much everything is cranked up, and we also do have FXAA enabled, and it is absolutely no problem yet again. Last but not least, we have Bioshock Infinite, which while not quite as graphically intensive as Crysis, is still a fantastic looking game. Here we have no problems whatsoever running it on full ultra settings with everything cranked up at 1080p, and even then we're still getting well above 60 frames per second at pretty much all times. To kick the build off, we're going to be using an Intel Core i5 4670K processor. Now this is one of the new Intel Haswell CPUs that just came out a couple days ago, and overall it's a nice improvement over the last generation, giving you about 10% more performance. Now of course this is a quad-core CPU clocked at 3.4 GHz, however since this is a K-series part, that means that we can overclock, and of course the rest of the build is totally designed to work with that as well. So I was able to get about 4.4 GHz on this Core i5, although every one is different, but at least getting 4 GHz is going to be absolutely no problem with this build. So overall you're going to get a ton of performance, all for about $240. For CPU cooler, we're going to be using a Corsair H80i. Now, water cooling is great for builds like this. However, when you get into making an entire custom loop, it becomes very complicated very fast. Whereas when you use a closed loop system such as the H80i, it's much simpler and you still get all the same benefits from using liquid cooling. So of course this is really going to be aimed at getting you a much better overclock on your Core i5, although of course the added benefit of getting rid of a giant ugly heatsink in the middle of your motherboard is also definitely appreciated. So this is definitely going to be worth it for about 90 bucks. For a motherboard, we're going to be using a Gigabyte GA-Z87X UD3H. So this is a great motherboard that supports pretty much all the features that you would expect, including obviously the Core i5 as well as overclocking it, up to 32 gigabytes of RAM, as well as, thanks to the Z87 chipset, up to 10 USB 3.0 ports and 8 SATA 3 ports, which means that you can plug in lots of SSDs, hard drives, all that kind of stuff. So overall this is a fantastic motherboard, all for about $190. For a graphics card, we're going to be using a 2GB EVGA GeForce GTX 770. Now this is another brand new card and delivers some very solid performance as you guys saw in the benchmarks earlier, but on top of that it's also a very nicely designed card with the new EVGA ACX cooler delivering lots of cooling performance, and you can also get a pretty decent overclock on this card if you'd like. Speaking of overclocks, this card is actually very similar to the old GTX 680, only it's clocked higher, it's got faster memory, and it's going to deliver tons and tons of performance for about $410. For memory, we're going to be using 8GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR3 RAM. Now this is solid stuff that I recommend in a lot of my builds. In fact, I'm using it in the system right behind me here, and that's because not only is it reliable, but it's also clocked at 1600 MHz, which in my opinion is still a sweet spot even on a Haswell based system like this. Now if 8GB isn't enough for you, you can very easily upgrade to 16GB very simply. However, for this system we're just going to stick with 8GB of RAM, all for about 68 bucks. For an SSD, we're going to be using a 120GB Samsung 840 series drive. Now an SSD is probably one of the best upgrades you can do to a computer, as it really does make a massive amount of difference in normal day-to-day tasks and even stuff like loading games. It just happens so much faster and so much more consistently that it makes a huge difference over a normal hard drive. So as far as the 840 series drive itself goes, it does have 120GB of capacity, which while definitely isn't much, is definitely plenty for your main games, for a couple of things like for example your programs, Windows, that kind of thing, and the rest of your stuff can definitely go on the other hard drive. And of course on top of that it is a Samsung drive, which means it's going to be very reliable, very quick, all for about 95 bucks. For the hard drive, we're going to be using a 1TB Western Digital Caviar Black. Now like I was saying with the SSD, while it's an awesome solution and much faster than pretty much any kind of normal hard drive that you can find, the one disadvantage is that you really don't get a whole lot of storage space. So that's where pairing it with a standard hard drive for your normal things, for example your pictures, your media, the kind of normal stuff that you don't need lightning fast access to, definitely makes sense with a standard hard drive. Now with 1 terabyte of storage, you're going to have plenty of room for pretty much all your kind of stuff, although I will mention that there's also a 2 terabyte version if you want to upgrade that. But on top of that, since it is a Caviar Black, it is actually pretty fast for a hard drive. Not quite as fast as the SSD, but still you're going to get very decent performance out of this for about $95. For a case, we're going to be using a Fractal Design Define R4. Now this is a silenced optimized case, which means that not only is it well built, but also does have some noise dampening foam inside, a door over the front intake, as well as 2 quiet fans connected to a fan controller. So that means that you're going to get still plenty of good performance without actually having to sacrifice on noise. On top of that, since it is a full-sized ATX enclosure, that means you have room for, of course, the motherboard, you have room for additional graphics cards, hard drives, fans, all that kind of fun stuff. And in fact, I like this case so much that, well, you can see one right behind me here, because that's what I've got my main build in. Anyway, if you want to pick up a Define R4, it's going to run you about $110. For the power supply, we're going to be using a 750 watt Corsair TX750M. Now with 750 watts of capacity, that's going to be more than enough to run your build as is, even with some overclocking. But on top of that, you could add an additional GTX 770 to the build and it will run no problem. On top of that, since it is an 80 plus bronze certified power supply, it's going to be fairly efficient and well built. And it is a modular power supply as well, which means it's going to be a lot easier to get all the cables out of the way, as instead of having to deal with tugging a bunch of stuff behind the motherboard and underneath the drive trays and all that kind of stuff. You just simply only plug in the exact things that you need, and everything else will just stay out of the way. So for about $115, this is going to be a great power supply for the build. For the optical drive, we're going to be using an LG Blu-ray drive. Now this is definitely optional. I know for me, I hardly ever use any kind of DVD or Blu-ray drive. However, it is definitely something nice to have if you ever need to install a disc, for example, or you want to watch a movie, as of course this is not only going to be working with Blu-rays, but of course DVDs and CDs as well. So there's not a whole lot to say about this. You can freely decide to skip out on it and save yourself a little bit of money. But if you do want a Blu-ray drive in your computer, it's only going to run you about $40. So there you have it, an awesome $1,500 gaming computer. Of course, prices are always changing, so I will have links to everything I mentioned in the description of this video, as well as some additional upgrades. So for example, if you wanted more RAM, a bigger hard drive, maybe a Wi-Fi adapter, whatever, I'll have some additional links in the description if you guys want to do some upgrades to the computer. If you're interested in more, feel free to check out my full tutorial on how to build a gaming PC. And if you enjoyed, definitely be sure to leave this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more PC builds like this. Anyway guys, I will catch you next time.